Imagine terror that spans 3 decades, 3 separate crime sprees, and the entire state of California, yet the man behind it all simply disappears into suburban obscurity. That was the Golden State Killer. For 40 years, he was a ghost. More than 50 rapes, at least 13 murders, hundreds of burglaries, and still no name. Composite sketches faded, witnesses aged, and evidence boxes collected dust. So how did a handful of invisible skin cells and a website meant for family history finally expose him? In this video, we're walking step by step through how DNA, especially a new technique called genetic genealogy, took this case from hopelessly cold to solved. We'll go inside the actual investigative process, building a genetic profile, using public genealogy databases, constructing family trees, and closing in on one retired cop named Joseph James DeAngelo. By the end, you'll see exactly how science and persistence cracked one of America's most infamous cold cases. To understand how DNA solved the Golden State Killer case, we need to start with the story behind the evidence. Between the mid-1970s and mid-1980s, a predator later nicknamed the East Area Rapist, then the original Night Stalker, stalked California neighborhoods. He attacked couples in their homes, tied them up, and terrorized entire communities. Then, abruptly, the crime stopped, at least on paper. For decades, investigators, journalists, and citizen sleuths chased leads. But it wasn't until advances in DNA analysis and genetic genealogy that a real breakthrough came. In this video, I'll walk you carefully through each step of that process. No jargon without explanation, no skipped stages. If you're into deep dive true crime and want more cases broken down like this, consider subscribing and turning on the notification bell. And stay with me until the end, because we'll also talk about the ethical questions this case opened up about privacy and DNA databases. The man we now call the Golden State Killer didn't start as an infamous serial predator. His crimes evolved over time, and the connections weren't obvious at first. In the mid-1970s, around Sacramento, he was known only as the East Area Rapist, breaking into homes at night, often targeting couples. He'd bind the man, stack dishes on his back as an alarm system, and assault the woman for hours. Communities bought guns, dogs, and extra locks. People slept with lights on. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, in Southern California, a new unknown killer emerged, the original Night Stalker. He attacked and murdered couples in their homes with brutal precision. Police agencies in different jurisdictions didn't yet realize they were likely hunting the same person. Meanwhile, he committed hundreds of burglaries as the so-called Visalia ransacker. These were treated as separate crime waves, with separate files, separate investigators, and no unifying suspect yet. The first critical step toward identifying the Golden State Killer came with a basic but powerful question: are these different crimes connected by the same DNA? By the 1990s, forensic science had advanced enough to extract and profile DNA from biological evidence left at crime scenes: semen, skin cells, blood. Technicians went back to preserved evidence from both the East Area Rapist and original Night Stalker cases. Using STR, short tandem repeat analysis, they developed DNA profiles from multiple scenes. The breakthrough: the profiles matched each other. The rapist in Sacramento and the killer in Southern California were the same man. This consolidated dozens of cases into one massive serial offender investigation. But knowing the same person committed these attacks still didn't reveal who he was. When his DNA was checked against CODIS, the national database of convicted offenders, there were no hits. That meant he'd never been arrested for a qualifying crime that required a DNA swab. With a confirmed DNA profile but no match in CODIS, investigators faced a wall. Traditional methods, interviews, tips, suspect lists had been exhausted many times over. The case seemed unsolvable. Then, forensic DNA technology took another leap. Beyond simple, does this DNA match that DNA comparisons, scientists began using SNP, single nucleotide polymorphism, testing. This looks at hundreds of thousands of points across a person's genome, creating a far more detailed genetic portrait. This type of data is what consumer DNA sites like 23andMe and Ancestry use for ancestry breakdowns and relative matching. Crucially, it can reveal distant relatives, not just exact matches. Around the mid-2010s, a group of cold case investigators, including Paul Holes and others, realized if they could convert the Golden State Killer's STR profile into a broader SNP-style profile, they might be able to treat him like a user on a genealogy site and see who in the wider population he was genetically related to. Next came one of the most pivotal and controversial moves in modern forensic history, uploading an unknown killer's genetic information to a public genealogy database. Investigators partnered with a lab to generate a SNP-based genetic profile from the Golden State Killer's crime scene DNA. But they couldn't just upload that to commercial sites like Ancestry or 23andMe. Those companies prohibit direct law enforcement uploads for criminal investigation. Instead, they turned to GEDmatch, a free, third-party site where users voluntarily upload raw DNA data from various testing companies to find relatives. GEDmatch had more flexible terms and, at that time, allowed law enforcement use with minimal explicit oversight. They created a generic user account, labeled the upload as belonging to a deceased individual, and quietly submitted the Golden State Killer's reconstructed profile. The goal wasn't to find him directly, it was to find his relatives, even distant ones, and work backward through family trees. Once the profile was on GEDmatch, the site did what it always does. Compared it against millions of other users' DNA to look for shared segments indicating common ancestors. No exact match appeared. That would have meant the killer himself had tested. Instead, investigators got something almost as valuable. Several individuals who appeared to be distant cousins, sharing small but significant stretches of DNA. This is where the painstaking work began. A genetic genealogist, most notably Barbara Ray Venter, joined the team. Her job? Take those distant matches and, using traditional genealogy records, build out both their family trees. She dug into census records, birth and death certificates, obituaries, marriage licenses, and online family trees. Piece by piece, she reconstructed branches going back generations, then searched for where those branches might converge, where a potential common ancestor linked the Golden State Killer to these living matches. Building family trees from distant DNA matches is like solving a 3D puzzle without the picture on the box. The genealogist started with the known relatives in GEDmatch, sketched out their parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents, then identified shared ancestors, often couples from the early 1900s or late 1800s. Once those common ancestors were identified, the team built forward instead of backward, tracing all their descendants down through the decades to the present day. Every child, sibling, and cousin added new branches. From there, investigators overlaid basic case facts. The offender was male, likely white, active in California during specific years, and probably born between certain dates. Anyone who didn't fit, wrong sex, age, location, was crossed off. Through this process, they reduced a huge web of possible descendants to a more manageable cluster of men who, on paper and genetically, could be the Golden State Killer. One surname in particular began to stand out: DeAngelo. With a short list of possible male descendants from the relevant family branches, detectives moved from abstract genealogy back to classic police work. They ran criminal histories, employment records, addresses, and past residences for each man. One name leapt out: Joseph James DeAngelo. He was a former police officer who had worked in areas overlapping some early crimes. He had lived in multiple parts of California during the exact years the Golden State Killer was active. His age and physical description were compatible with surviving witness statements. Still, suspicion isn't proof. The team quietly built a profile: where he shopped, his routines, vehicles he drove, relatives nearby. They didn't yet have probable cause to swab his DNA directly, and tipping him off could mean destroyed evidence or danger to officers. The plan became: watch, wait, and retrieve something he discarded in public where there's no expectation of privacy to compare against the old crime scene DNA. Surreptitious DNA collection is delicate. Investigators must obtain a sample legally, without contamination and without alarming the suspect. In April 2018, detectives began tailing DeAngelo in Citrus Heights, California. Reports indicate they first collected an item he discarded in public, a piece of trash, such as a tissue or cup, containing trace DNA. That sample went to the lab for comparison against the Golden State Killer's known profile. The initial result was promising but not conclusive enough. Investigators retrieved a second discarded item, often described as a car door handle swab or similar, to strengthen the comparison. When the lab ran the tests, the answer was finally clear. The DNA from Joseph DeAngelo's discarded items matched the DNA from multiple Golden State Killer crime scenes. Statistically, it was virtually impossible this was anyone else. After decades of fear, speculation, and mystery, they had a name and biological proof tying him to the crimes. On April 24, 2018, a quiet Sacramento suburb woke up to a swarm of law enforcement vehicles. Plainclothes officers moved in on the modest home of a 72-year-old retired mechanic, Joseph James DeAngelo. Neighbors watched, stunned, as this seemingly ordinary man was led away in handcuffs. Inside, detectives found a man who had spent decades living a double life, raising a family, working jobs, riding motorcycles, while a monstrous past remained hidden. He reportedly reacted with a mixture of confusion and a cryptic comment about having a split personality, though he later gave no meaningful public explanation. News broke quickly. The long-hunted Golden State Killer, East Area Rapist, original Night Stalker, these separate legends, were one person, now under arrest. He was charged initially with multiple counts of murder across several counties. Rape charges were largely barred by statutes of limitations. Families of victims, some now elderly, finally had a name and a face to connect to their nightmares. The use of genetic genealogy in the Golden State Killer case ignited a firestorm of ethical and legal debate. On one hand, families devastated by brutal crimes finally saw justice approaching. On the other, privacy advocates worried. If your distant cousin uploads DNA to a public site, should that genetic connection effectively enroll you in a de facto law enforcement database? At the time of the investigation, GED matches policies allowed widespread use by police with limited notice to users. After public outcry, the site changed its rules, requiring people to opt in for law enforcement matching. Some commercial testing companies explicitly banned such use. Others quietly cooperated in certain serious cases. Legal scholars questioned whether genetic genealogy searches should require warrants or whether public upload equals implied consent. There's still no universal standard. What's clear is that this single case reshaped how society thinks about the intersection of personal genomics, privacy, and policing. In 2020, facing overwhelming DNA evidence and the risk of the death penalty, Joseph DeAngelo agreed to a sweeping plea deal. In a packed Sacramento courtroom, he formally admitted to 13 murders and dozens of rapes and kidnappings, and acknowledged many other uncharged crimes. This spared victims and families the ordeal of multiple lengthy trials across different counties. Survivors and relatives confronted him directly, delivering powerful impact statements describing decades of fear, trauma, and stolen normalcy. DeAngelo sat in an orange jumpsuit and a wheelchair, mostly silent, occasionally whispering, "I'm sorry," though many found his remorse hollow. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, effectively ensuring he will die behind bars. The end of the legal process didn't erase the pain, but it did provide a measure of closure and established a courtroom record tying his name definitively to the Golden State Killer's sprawling list of atrocities. Stepping back, the Golden State Killer case teaches several key lessons about modern crime solving. First, DNA is incredibly powerful, but its real strength emerges over time. Evidence collected in the 1970s, properly preserved, became the foundation for a breakthrough 4 decades later. Good evidence handling today can solve tomorrow's cases. Second, genetic genealogy turned a dead-end DNA profile into an active investigative tool. By looking for relatives instead of a direct match, detectives gained a new way to identify unknown offenders. That method has since been used in hundreds of other cold cases worldwide. Third, these techniques force us to confront serious privacy questions. Our genetic information doesn't just belong to us. It's shared with our relatives, whether they like it or not. Finally, this case shows the value of persistence. Generations of investigators, journalists, and citizens refused to let the file close. And when technology caught up, they were ready to act. If you've made it this far, you now understand step by step how DNA and genetic genealogy finally unmasked the Golden State Killer. From early crime scenes, to STR profiles, to SNP analysis, to GED match family trees, to a single discarded item tying Joseph DeAngelo to decades of horror. If you want more deep dive breakdowns of how forensic science is changing true crime beyond surface level recaps, this is exactly what we do here. Take a second to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and let me know in the comments which case or forensic technique you'd like unpacked next. I'm also curious where you land on the ethics. Should genetic genealogy be fair game for all serious crimes, or limited to murders and rapes, or not used at all? Share your thoughts. I read as many as I can. Thanks for watching, stay curious, and stay safe.